Imagine you are standing in a crowd on the streets of Rome. People from all corners of the empire have gathered to witness the most talked about wedding of the year. The emperor is marrying a young bride. She looks like a goddess, with a golden crown on her head, and eyes shining with fear and uncertainty. And none of us knows that in less than a day, she will be dead. Imagine Rome in its heyday. The forum buzzes like a giant beehive. The cries of merchants, the clink of coins, the smell of hot bread mingles with the thick aroma of incense rising from the temples. Between the marble columns and bronze statues, the fates of not only senators and generals are decided, but also those whose names will never make it into the chronicles. In those days, being born into a noble family was both a blessing and a curse. For a son, it meant a chance for military glory or a seat in the Senate. For a daughter, it meant waiting to see who she would be given to. In Rome, marriage was not about love, but about power. It was an agreement between families that strengthened their position or saved them from the wrath of the emperor. She was 14. In Rome, this was considered the ideal age for a bride, old enough to have children, but still young enough not to spoil her reputation. Her virginity was not a personal virtue, but the property of her family, a symbol of honor that had to be passed on to the right hands. Girls in Rome had no real rights. After marriage, they became the property of their husbands or their families. If the husband was the emperor, the situation was paradoxical. The wife of the most influential man in the empire was at the same time a shadow, deprived of her own voice. Her every gesture, every glance, could be interpreted as a political signal, and punished. She was born into a respected senatorial family. Her name has now been almost erased from history, which perhaps best speaks to her fate. She grew up amid the silence of luxurious atriums, studied Virgil's poems, and played the lute by the light of oil lamps. Her world was small and protected, but no wall could shield her from an order issued in the emperor's chambers. The news came suddenly: the emperor was taking her as his wife. For her family, it was an honor that could not be refused. For her, it was a sentence that could not be spoken aloud. He was much older. Stern. His smile was colder than marble. He was followed by a trail of lost wives. Rumors spread throughout the city that the emperor's wife belonged not only to her husband, but also to the state. If she gave birth to an heir, the child would be taken away, and even the mother would have no say in his fate. In the palace, the wife quickly became a symbol, a decoration for the throne, not a living person. The wedding was prepared with great pomp. Craftsmen worked day and night to sew a thin, almost transparent linen tunic, prepare jewelry, and select a veil the color of flame. The city buzzed with rumors. It seemed that everyone was happy, except for one person. Livia was a servant who had known the girl since childhood, her fears and secrets. In the last days, she looked at the bride as if saying goodbye. Not a word, but her gaze said more than any warning. Did she know something about the emperor? Did she remember how his previous wife had disappeared? In those days, even guesses could cost you your life. And so, as Rome was decorated with laurels, priests prepared altars, and incense smoke drifted over the city. The girl stood on the threshold of the greatest day of her life, and perhaps her last. A Roman wedding is not just a celebration. It is almost a military operation, where every gesture, every movement, every detail matters. There are no accidents. Everything is part of an ancient script that even emperors obeyed. On the eve of the wedding, she was prepared as if she were a sacrifice to the gods. Her hair was divided into 7 strands, and braided into plaits, a number that was supposed to protect her from evil spirits. Then it was tied into a knot called the knot of Hercules. According to tradition, only her husband could untie it on their wedding night. The symbolism was clear. Even her hairstyle was a reminder of her complete dependence on her future husband. She was dressed in a white linen tunic, the color of purity, but also of silence. Here, white did not scream, but erased personality, turning the bride into a blank slate, on which her husband had the right to write whatever he wanted. On top of that, she wore a flame-colored veil, flammeum. It was believed to ward off evil spirits, but for many it was a reminder, now she was the fire of someone else's home, not her own. Before leaving for the groom's house, the priests performed a sacrifice. And that was when something happened, that those who saw it would never forget. When the priest placed the lamb on the altar, the flame did not light immediately. For the Romans, this was an ominous sign. The gods were hesitant to accept the gift. A whisper ran through the crowd, but it quickly died down. Who would dare to voice a bad omen, when it came to the emperor's wedding? A strange silence also reigned in the palace, amid the ostentatious luxury. Marble and gold, incense from Arabia, perfect order. But the maids moved quickly, their eyes downcast. It could have been just tension before the big day, or they knew something they weren't saying. The old servants avoided talking about the emperor's previous wife. Her name was not mentioned. The story had disappeared, leaving only silence, and it was louder than any words. In Rome, the ability to forget could be as important a political tool as the ability to remember. She may not have understood this. Or she pretended not to understand. On this day, the eyes of the entire city were on her. She had to smile and look happy. In Rome, even a woman going to her death had to behave with dignity, so as not to disgrace her family. The chariots were already waiting. The crowd was waiting. She left the house wearing white linen, a fiery veil, and 7 braids tied in a Hercules knot. The smell of incense filled the air. Step by step, she approached the moment that would go down in history, but not at all as her parents had dreamed. Roman weddings were always a spectacle. But when the emperor got married, they turned into a demonstration of power, wealth, and the immutability of authority. On this day, Rome did not just celebrate, it watched. And everyone standing along the streets understood, this was not just a union between two people. It was a pact between the gods and the state. The bride was taken to the emperor's house in a festive procession, deductio in domum meriti. Musicians with flutes and trumpets led the way. Behind them were girls with torches, a symbol of the new hearth. The torches were made from rowan branches, a tree considered to be protective. People threw grain and dates at their feet, for good luck and fertility. From a distance, it all looked like a fairy tale. But those who saw it up close knew that not all fairy tales end happily. Entering her husband's house was also a ritual. She had to say, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are, Gaius, there I am, Gaia. It was an oath with no way out. In Rome, even divorce did not save a woman from the political consequences of marriage to an emperor. Then the banquet began. Tables groaned under the weight of figs, oysters, roasted peacocks, and fruits from Africa. The rooms smelled of cedar resin and fragrant oils. The guests laughed, raised their glasses, and made toasts. But if you looked closely, not everyone was smiling. Some of the emperor's entourage avoided looking at the bride. One of the senior senators, a witness to his previous marriage, turned away when she passed by. Perhaps it was a coincidence. Or maybe he just saw before him the next victim of a system that knows no mercy. The emperor sat nearby, but did not look at her. His gaze wandered somewhere deep into the hall. His hands were motionless. His face was impenetrable. Was this his usual coldness? Or was it the first sign that the coming night would not bring happiness? She smiled, as custom demanded. But a shadow flashed across her eyes. Perhaps she remembered the faint flame on the altar, during the sacrifice. Or perhaps she felt a different kind of cold, not from the marble walls of the palace, but from the man, to whom she was now bound forever. All the rituals had been performed, all the rules observed. Rome had got its spectacle. And what awaited behind the closed doors of the emperor's chambers no longer belonged to the guests, the senators, or even the gods. In ancient Rome, the first wedding night did not belong only to the spouses. It was part of a grand ritual that was supposed to confirm the union of the families and the purity of the bride. After the banquet, she was led to her chambers in a torchlight procession. Songs rang out, some humorous, some obscene. They were meant to scare away evil spirits and remind everyone of the main purpose of marriage, the birth of an heir. A torch, symbolizing the fire of the new home, was carried in front. In her case, it was held by the eldest matron, a widow who, according to custom, passed on the wisdom of married life to the young bride. They stopped at the threshold. Custom required that the bride be lifted up, so that she would not stumble. Stumbling was considered a bad omen. People watched this with religious seriousness. When the door closed, everything that happened next became a secret. But not completely. In wealthy homes, maids or matrons remained behind a curtain, to confirm in the morning that the marriage had taken place. For the emperor's wife, even this moment remained under the invisible eye of the state. How did she feel, left alone with a husband twice her age, and burdened by rumors? Did her heart pound with fear? Did her hands tremble, when she touched the knot of Hercules in her hair, knowing that only he could untie it? The emperor was not drunk. His cold sobriety was more frightening than any drunken rampage. In Rome, true power often appeared calm, but acted ruthlessly. What happened that night remained a mystery. But at dawn, when the servants entered the chambers, the silence was so thick that they stopped at the threshold. A motionless figure lay on the bed. An orange veil lay on the floor, as if it had been torn off and thrown away in haste. Thus ended the night that was to be the beginning of a new life. And at the same time, it was the beginning of another legend, about a woman whose story in Rome ended before it had even begun. Rome was waking up. Behind the palace walls, kitchen pots clanged, the bare feet of slaves pattered, and fabrics rustled, as maids hung togas out in the sun. Life in the palace never stops. But this morning, the air was thick, as if a storm were brewing. According to custom, after the wedding night, the couple had to appear together. The emperor in a simple tunic, the bride with her hair unbraided, as a sign of her new status. Everyone was waiting. Senators, priests, court ladies, everyone had to see her, to confirm that the union had taken place. Time passed. The doors remained closed. The maids who were supposed to prepare her for her exit, returned with faces as pale as wax. They whispered, too quietly for anyone to hear. Something disturbing flashed in the eyes of the court ladies. The emperor came out alone. His face was stony, his movements perfectly calm. In Rome, such coldness meant either complete control, or mortal danger. Some whispered of a sudden illness. Others spoke of an accident. But in a palace where every word could be a death sentence, no questions were asked. Death in the emperor's house was never just a tragedy. It was a political issue. Bodies were removed quickly, before rumors could take root. Burials were changed or cancelled, if the honor or safety of the throne demanded it. Relatives might never know where their loved ones were laid to rest. It is said, that on the same night, a small procession was seen outside the city. The chariot moved silently, the lanterns hidden under cloaks. 2 slaves, and a priestess of Vesta, walked alongside. Where they were going, and whom they were carrying, remained a mystery. The next day, there was an empty space next to the throne. And a conspiracy of silence, that everyone understood. No one saw, no one heard, no one asked. In Rome, it was always known that what was not recorded in the chronicles would eventually disappear from memory. The imperial court knew how to keep secrets so well that even the most loyal chroniclers did not dare to write a single extra word on parchment. Her story became just like that. Her name disappeared from the records just a few months after the wedding. A dry, faceless phrase appeared in the chronicles. The union was declared invalid due to divine signs that prevented the marriage. For those who knew the court, this meant one thing: she was no longer to be spoken of. But the memory lived on, in whispers. Among the maids, there were fragmentary conversations, in dark corridors. Among the old matrons, there were quiet sighs, when someone remembered the orange veil. Among the slaves, there were short, quick glances, that flashed and disappeared. In a city, where a careless word could land you in the dungeons of the Tullianum, silence was the only shield. Why did she die, on her first night? Some believed it was illness, the whim of the gods, an accident. Others whispered about the cold hand of power. The emperor, they said, did not tolerate disobedience, even in small matters. A woman could die, not for treason or intrigue, but simply for failing to live up to expectations. Even if those expectations were to give birth to an heir. Perhaps it was a political mistake that had to be erased before dawn. Perhaps he had learned something that made the marriage dangerous. Or perhaps the reason was so personal and dark that even his closest advisors did not know the truth. Now, all that remains of her are fragments. Hints in other people's letters. A half-erased mention in the chronicles. A shadow in legend. She will no longer walk the streets of Rome. Sit next to him on the throne. Or make sacrifices to Juno. Her wedding became her funeral. This is the cruelty of Rome. Not only in its actions, but also in how easily it erased those who stood in the way of official history. Her death is not just the tragedy of one girl, but a reminder that here, you could lose everything. Even the very right to be named.